Hello and welcome to the 7th Nonprofit Data Research Seminar. In this series, we're sharing research that is on or about the nonprofit sector, using data about charities, nonprofits broadly defined, about the sector or charity or data used by them. I'm delighted that this month we're joined by Tom Wallace, who is going to talk about a form of data that we haven't looked at yet in the seminar series, data that has been scraped from social networks, and in particular to look at how charities are using Twitter in particular by analysing this data. As usual, if you have questions for Tom, please feel free to enter them using the YouTube comments. You can do that anytime during the talk or afterwards. And I will then curate those questions for Tom at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to make any comments or questions as you like as we go along. As always, we're looking for new presenters. We're doing interesting work related to nonprofit data. So if you have work that you'd like to talk about, then please do get in touch. The details are in the description for the video below. So let's press on. I'd like to introduce Tom and the work he's going to talk about, which is the Big Bird Gets the Worm: How Size Influences Social Networking by Charitable Organizations. Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm fine.
Excellent. Okay, I will hand over to you.
Great.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Great. So yes, as Alasdair said, I'm Tom Wallace. This talk is based on a paper that I'm working on with Alasdair. It's currently under review. And the research based on that uses, as Alasdair mentioned, a slightly unusual form of charities data. So you might think of charities data as being surveys undertaken with charities or regulator data about charities, but the data I'm using is about the charity's use of social media. So it's sort of less metadata about the charity and more about their use of a communications method. So Twitter is the chosen social network for this research. And that reflects its popularity among charities and also the accessibility of it for research. It's easier to get Twitter data than some other social networks, notably Facebook. So Twitter itself is a global phenomenon. It's a massive company. It's a massive social network. And in the last few years, it started to kind of get into popular culture in ways that social networks hadn't before. Think of Trump's use of the platform, the spreading of fake news on the platform, and things like the Arab Spring, where a movement for social change has been driven by social media, or not necessarily by social media, but it's been a facilitator of that movement, and it's allowed people to connect and change the way things are done in societies. So charities rely on communications with each other, with funders, with donors, really relationships. Charities can't operate in bubbles. So many use social media, social networks, coming out of the work they did previously in sort of their communications departments or just trying to get their message out there. Social media is kind of a natural fit for a lot of the things that charities do in the way that they work. So it's unsurprising that social media, and particularly Twitter, are quite common. Our usage of them is quite common among charitable organizations. At least in certain areas. We look at the England and Wales charity sector in this research. So there is existing research into how charities use social media. It goes back quite a long way to sort of not quite the dawn of social media, which would be the sort of mid 2000s, but it goes back to the sort of late 2000s, into the 2010s, and it tends to cover how charities use social media in a kind of either a qualitative way or through content analysis. It sort of looks at deeper patterns of interaction. What sort of messages are charities sharing? Who are they sharing with? How are they building communities? Very commonly looks at how charities interact with their donors. So you think of how companies often use social media. Companies tend to interact with their customers on social media. They see it as a platform for that communication. But charities are obviously very different from companies, conventional companies, in that they're often more interested in communicating with the wider sector and communicating with each other. And there's a lot less attention being paid to that side of social media charity relationships. And there has also been a lot less sort of quantitative or social network data research done on charities. It does exist, but there's a lot less of it. So size, when you start looking at charities and social media, you start thinking about size. Size is a sort of persistent factor throughout charities research. Very small charities are obviously very, very different types of organizations from very, very big charities. And social media is interesting in that some people have claimed that it sort of levels the playing field for charities. So charities size stratifies how charities have always engaged with technology. Think of computer systems in the 1980s and 90s, or websites in the 2000s. Larger charities tend to get these resources and these ways of doing things faster and in more depth because they have more money to dedicate to them. Social media is a bit different from them. It's not really an infrastructure you have to get. It doesn't really require any specialist skills. So there had been a claim in the early literature that it levels the playing field for smaller organizations. It democratizes access to this new communications method because it can be engaged with by charities of any size. So I set out to test that postulate, and this ties into a theme that had been running in the previous literature for a while around random sampling and the lack of a proper random sampled study to look at size. The suggestions about size leveling the playing field had come out of studies that used different types of samples and didn't randomly sample. So the research questions which this paper looked at were: does organizational size affect the likelihood of ownership of a handle? Does it affect the level of use of the platform? So they're obviously different. You can own a handle and not use it, or you can be more engaged with the platform. And does it affect the dynamics of the network that emerges from charity interaction on Twitter? So that's charity to charity interaction. Are those networks mediated by size or not? So that's sort of three different levels of Twitter interaction and Twitter use in greater depth that the research seeks to investigate. So back to random sampling, which had been called for in the literature. It's obvious to most data literate people, researchers, that random sampling has benefits in terms of robustness and hypothesis testing, generalizability. But in the case of studying the charity sector, it has another benefit in that the charity sector in most countries is extremely skewed towards lots and lots of small organizations and a small number of very, very large, very, very wealthy organizations. And that presents a problem for sampling these organizations to do research on them. A common way of getting a sample in the literature was to do sort of top 100 style sampling, where they would select a list of top 100 charities in a particular country or in a particular segment of a sector and base their research around that. And that obviously has problems in that it doesn't treat size properly. That if you do that, you're going to end up with far more larger charities than the smaller ones. And the skew also means you can't just take a completely random sample, because you would end up with lots and lots and lots of small charities. And although that would be proportionally correct, it would be difficult to do analysis on that sort of sample. So we chose, in order to combat both of those problems, a stratified sample. So we chose England and Wales, as I mentioned earlier. It's got a good amount of data available. We're very familiar with it as a sector. We chose a data set produced by Alcock and Moen. It's hosted on the UK Data Service. It has a collection of charities from England and Wales. I will go more into that data set and what it is and what it isn't in the next slide, I think. We picked income as our measure of size. and we picked income bands to stratify our sample from the NCVO, and they're there in that small table. So four categories: small, medium, large, major, with their given size bands, their income bands next to them. So the way we treated that data when we had it is it was a panel or a repeated cross section of data. So we took the most populous year of the data, split it into the income bands as shown before, and then used a random number generator to draw 200 charities from each of those bands. So that was us taking our stratified random sample of the sector. Before we did that, we did exclude certain organizations based on keywords, schools, churches, universities, generally organizations that are sort of sometimes not considered part of the sector. They often have another regulator that isn't just the charities regulator. So just to kind of try and make the sample as unbiased or lower the variance of it, we just thought to remove those sort of borderline cases with keywords. It could have been done a better way perhaps than keyword searching, but in this case we used keywords and just dropped charities that had school in the name or university in the name. Now, the Alcock and Moan data isn't the population of the charity sector in England and Wales. It's also a stratified random sample. Their aim was to collect 100% or close to of the largest charities, and then diminishing percentages of smaller and smaller organisations below that. This wasn't a problem because our income bands fit over their bands effectively. We don't cross over any of the bands. So we're taking a random stratified sample of a stratified random sample, and therefore it shouldn't be a problem that we're sort of 2 levels into that random sample. It would be better to take a random sample purely from the population, but the data with income information available was in the format of an already stratified random sample. So that was something we had to consider when we were collecting the data or designing the data collection. So we drew 200 from each of our bands, which came from multiple bands of theirs, and that ended up with 800 charities for all 4 bands. Then we had to go and collect the Twitter handles for those charities. So we didn't collect 800 Twitter handles. We collected 40 for each of the bands, so 160 in total. The reason the sample was overdrawn to 800 is because not every charity has a Twitter handle. So if we just drew 40 for each, we would have gone through and realized only 30 of a certain strata had Twitter handles. So we overdrew it to begin with and then just collected up to 40. As soon as we had 40 for each band, we stopped collecting for them. So we ended up with 40 in each, 160 in total with valid Twitter handles. With that group of 160, we then put that data or those handles into a piece of software called NodeXL, which is an Excel extension for network analysis. And that let us gather Twitter metrics, usage metrics, and follower following links for those organizations. So usage metrics, we'll come on to this in the results, but usage metrics are things like their total follower counts, their total tweet counts. Follower following links are whether those organizations in that 160 sample are following each other. So that's our actual networking information. And that's not mentions. The other way to collect Twitter data is to collect who mentions who. We're collecting who follows who, which should give us a more static sample. Mentions change quite a lot. Follows tend to be a lot more static. They're easier to collect as well. So just onto the results, and the results kind of speak for the data we gathered. It tells you a bit about the underlying sort of data we gathered through the results. So the first research question was about handle ownership. Who owns a handle in these groups? And from this table, it's obvious that larger organizations are much more likely to own handles than smaller organizations. That's a very, very simple piece of analysis on that data. It's literally a count, a percentage-based count, and then there is a gamma at the bottom as well. But getting to this stage of just finding this simple finding required quite a lot of thinking about sampling and thinking about data collection and managing data collection and transferring data between different formats and collecting. So this simple metric is kind of underpinned by quite a lot of complexity of the way we collected the data. So if we move on to the metrics that I mentioned previously, which are collected by Node Excel, we've got followers, following, and tweets. That's each of these organizations' total followers, following, and tweets. And it's obvious on this graph with small on the left-hand side and major on the right-hand side that smaller organizations have less following, and tweets, and major organizations have a lot more. The pattern's obviously a lot less sharp in the following. So that's the organization's activity, who they're following. That's a lot less dramatic than who they're being followed by or the number of tweets they've made. But the patterns are fairly consistent across the size groupings, that as you become larger, you make more use of Twitter, at least measured by these metrics. So if we move on to the network rather than the outside metrics, being connected to the network. So this is just looking at who in that 160 are following each other and who is in that network and who isn't. Again, as the organizations get larger, they become increasingly more likely to connect to the network. And then the table below, I won't go into too much, but that tracks who sends follows and who receives them. So it's obvious in this that it's not just that small organizations are less active, they're also less popular, and large organizations are more active and more popular. So there's that disconnect between the two. There's popularity and activity, ways of sort of measuring use of Twitter. They reflect slightly different things. Here is the actual network that was collected, sorted by an algorithm. The organizations in it are grouped by size, color, and shape. So the small organizations are the tiny little diamonds that they might be hard to see depending what size screen you're watching on, all the way up to the deep black circles are the major organizations. And the thing to take away from this network, in all its complexity, is that the small organizations tend to be on the peripheries of the network. There aren't really any in the center at all. And the large and major organizations tend to be in the core of the network. So they're more central to the network. And we can see that descriptively as we look at the network picture, but we can also model these networks. So to really understand the dynamics of what's going on in this example of a charities network, because remember, this is just the 160 that we stratified, sampled. This isn't the whole sector. It's a slice of the whole sector, which may be representative of it to some extent. So to really understand what's going on in this slice, we decided to use network modeling rather than just looking at that diagram and saying we think this is what's going on. So you can't model networks with normal methods. So we used specific network modeling technique, exponential random graph modeling. It uses a type of estimation called MCMC, Markov chain Monte Carlo estimation. It's a simulation-based metric, so it generates networks and tries to match them to the input network. I won't go too far into it. Feel free to ask questions about it if you want. It's a complicated method. It can be difficult to interpret, but they are quite powerful if you want to describe how networks really hang together without just looking at that and thinking, I don't know, it's too complicated. So we used PNet to estimate our ERGMs, and we do 3 different ERGM models. There's a sort of control almost model, and then there are 2 measures of size: continuous income, just income, and then groups based on the strata that we've talked about. All the other methods I've used so far are 4 income groups split into bands. And it might make more sense as we look at the results of some of these models. So on this first model, we're really just looking at that first column and briefly interpreting this model. Don't pay attention to arc. That's like the intercept in a linear regression. Reciprocity is how likely charities are to send back a link once they've been followed. So if somebody follows them, are they likely to send a follow back in the other direction and form this 2-way link? We can see that is positive and significant. So that is more likely to happen than random. And all of these effects control for each other. Instar is our popularity measure that we've kind of talked about already in other analyses. That is also positive. So there are accounts in the network who are very popular. Outstar is activity, it's negative. Sync and source are kind of extra versions of those popularity and activity measures. So sync is popularity again. That's accounts that don't send anything out, they just receive in. So imagine a very large charity who doesn't have time to follow everyone else, but everybody follows them because they're large and they have a large following. And then we have some triangle effects and two paths, which are to do with clustering. They're not very important in this network, so I won't talk about them. When we add income to this and look at the income model, this is the second column, model 2, and it has these extra effects for income. The only significant one is receiver, and that says that charities which have more income, richer/larger charities, tend to receive more follows. That makes sense. We've seen that effect throughout this research. Larger charities are more popular on social media. Not a particularly interesting finding, but it is here now in a robust modeling framework that is there. More interestingly, in our final model, our binary model, and again, this is column 3, and it has all these extra effects, but only a few of them are significant, and only one of them really matters, and that's the very first one, small sender, which is negative and significant. And what that says is that in comparison to medium charities, who are the base category, small charities tend to send less follows. They are less active on social media than medium charities, and implicitly large and major, but we can't really make that claim without changing the base category. So this leads us on to a conclusion that is not just are big charities popular on Twitter. That's not really ever been in contention. That's fairly obvious from casual observation. But small charities are less active than other charities, which suggests that Twitter isn't this great leveler that some suggested it was. It's not just that small charities are on there and they're trying really hard and they're making all these tweets and doing all this following behavior and just not receiving back the popularity. They're not really there. They're less likely to have a handle, they're less likely to be active, and they're less likely to send follows to be active in the network as well as just in general tweeting. And this most likely comes down to time and staff. It's not really possible for small charities often to be on top of their game when it comes to Twitter. Yes, it's free, it doesn't require any infrastructure, it's low skill, but it requires time to build up a head of steam and really get onto the platform and get used to it and get using it. And small charities often just don't have that time and don't have the resources to do that, despite the fact that it's free nominally. So that is the big finding of our paper in a headline. Twitter is a very, very stratified place in terms of charities and size. At every stage of data, whether you're looking at handle ownership, usage metrics, networking, modeling, at every stage, size is clearly important in determining who is popular and who is active on social media, or at least on Twitter. So just coming on to some future work and some improvements that we could possibly make to this research. It's got quite a small sample. That's limited mostly by the manual collection. Having to go through every charity and search Google for their Twitter handle is time consuming, and it limits the size that we could really use. So it would be good to find an automated way of collecting those handles, and that would also let us collect a non-stratified random sample and compare the results and see what happens when we just include the skew that's in the sector. Do the results change? Do they not? That would add a bit of replication and a bit of robustness to the findings. And it also kind of predicated on finding an automated way of collecting those handles, which would be a paper in itself. It's a big job involving machine learning, but kind of watch this space. And I think the paper also sets the foundation for sort of other features of charities to be considered on social media. So is there a stratification in the type of charity that tends to use social media? Do some feel that they need to use social media more than others? I think that work is important. We didn't consider that in this because it kind of muddied the message with regard to size. But now we've established that size is definitely an important factor in social media usage by charities. I think that other research, either by ourselves or other people, could come and build on that work and add more richness to the story around charity use of social media. And I think, that is me. So thank you for listening, and I'll pass you back to Alasdair.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. That was really interesting. So I think there's a really interesting combination there of some quite advanced social network analysis methods with some linked data drawn from different sources. So you have transactional data from Twitter and then the administrative data on the charitable organisations themselves. Just a reminder, if you've got questions for Tom, feel free to make comments. To ask those questions in the comments of the video, and I will pass them on to Tom. But I thought I would start by asking Tom if you could say a little bit more about that collecting of the Twitter handles. So you did touch on it again at the end there in the further work, but how easy was it to do that manual searching to actually confidently identify the Twitter handles? And I mean, can you say a little bit more about the scope for automation? What are some of the challenges, and do you think that's achievable?
So it took about probably a full day of work spread over 2 days to collect those handles. It was done by taking the charity's official name from that Alcock and Moen administrative data set that we had and searching Google for that name with Twitter on the end. We use Google rather than Twitter's own search because Google's search is more powerful and tended to return better results than Twitter's search. It was usually pretty obvious where a hit was the correct charity. The name would be identical. The charity would have information about themselves in their bio that was easy to quickly identify. If there was any doubt over whether it was the charity's Twitter handle, their website was consulted. And if it matched, then it was clearly fine and it was entered into a big spreadsheet with all the handles. Where it wasn't difficult, so then per se, it was fairly obvious to check that the data was robust and that it was as it should be. It was just tedious and time consuming, and it opened itself up to human mistakes. So it was not that difficult to go back through and check 160, but I wouldn't want to do that again, and I certainly wouldn't want to make a bigger sample out of that with that method. So in terms of automating the process, the issue with automating the process is kind of one of accuracy and bias. So making sure that your error rate is kind of low enough to be acceptable to whatever research you want to do with it. But also there's the potential to kind of miss big chunks. So one easy way to automate Twitter handle collection is just to scrape it off their site. So just to go to every charity's site as listed with the Charity Commission, take the Twitter tags that they have on their site and just use that. The problem being not every charity has a site, not every charity with one has it listed on the Charity Commission, not every charity with a site puts Twitter on it, and some have Twitter and don't have a site. It's a big mess. And you end up with a big list of handles, but they're not random. They're biased towards whoever put it on their site and then launched their site with the commission. So you end up with this subset that you don't know anything about. That could be fine in some applications. I think for this paper in particular, it was important to have a proper stratified random sample. In terms of fixing that problem with the automation, it probably relies on taking that subset of confirmed handles and then using some form of machine learning to apply to learn what those look like and then apply them to a larger set of handles that may or may not be charities, so that it can decide this is a charity, this isn't a charity. And that's obviously quite a large job and has an accuracy rate associated with it as well. So there's quite a lot of challenges there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. That was really helpful. I guess the other particularly interesting aspect of the paper is the method. So is the exponential random graph modeling, and as you described, it's quite complex, both to understand as a method and then to actually estimate on a set of data. You spared us the technical detail of what's involved, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the advantage of it. So why is it worth getting to grips with that complexity and the challenges of getting a model to converge? A little bit more about the extra that gives us in analyzing the network. networks?
Yeah. So network analysis is a funny beast in terms of a section of methods, because it's very heavily dominated by descriptive methods, and it gets very, very complicated and very, very rich, extremely rich, much richer than the sort of descriptive methods we would use on conventional panel or even just cross-sectional data. With conventional methods, there's lots and lots of different network analysis methods that tell you lots of different things, but they tend to be descriptive rather than analytical, because of this problem with network data not working with the assumptions of frequentist statistics. So any method you would tend to want to use, it doesn't really work properly. Yeah, you can estimate them, but the results are not really what you want. So when you want to, there's often the point where you come to the end of a very in-depth network analysis where you've done a lot of different methods. You've done your E-I index and your sociograms and your connection tables, and you're still faced with that kind of, is this another factor? There's no control here, and there's sometimes is and sometimes isn't a sense of generalizability, some sort of p-value, or sense of how special or how different from random your results are. Some methods have that in network analysis, some don't, but getting that alongside the control of this is definitely down to this factor and not this other factor that we've controlled for is tricky. And really, you have to go to ERGM in order to get both of those and be able to say that this is definitely down to this, and we have controlled for all of these things. In the case of ERGM, we're using size, so we're trying to estimate the effect of size, and we're controlling for all the internal structures of the network. So it's not just down to smaller charities happening to be outside of the network for some reason. We can say that, oh no, size is definitely linked. It's not linked to that, and it's not quite causal. It kind of gets towards causality, but it's as robust, if not more robust, than normal regression methods. And that control and being able to control for factors is probably the key reason for going ahead with it.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so I have a question from the comments. So in the paper, you're focusing on charitable organizations communicating with each other, but charities are obviously using Twitter for other purposes as well, using social media for other purposes, and in particular perhaps for fundraising. And what potential do you think there is to distinguish between the different types of activity that charities might be using Twitter for, and then perhaps to take that further to looking at the use of it for fundraising, and then the impact on the amount of money generated through fundraising?
Yeah, so we've the research we did kind of touched on a few things that would be also relevant to charities networks for fundraising, where they're talking mostly to their donors or other organizations involved in their fundraising. Sort of things like their general level of activity, their number of tweets, the size of their network in general. But then our paper obviously goes off in that other direction and looks at charity to charity instead of that wider network. There are different challenges in studying that wider network, because it tends to be wider. It tends to have a lot more members in it, but it's a lot less, it's a lot more disparate, a lot less tight. It's also tends to be a lot more one-directional. So charities tend to use Twitter as an information sharing medium to broadcast messages to their fundraisers, to their donors, to try and encourage them to donate, rather than this sort of reciprocal nature of networking we see when it comes to charity interaction. So I think there's lots of opportunities for studying fundraising and sort of donations through Twitter, and sort of campaigns, drives, that sort of thing. It's a slightly different challenge from what we've done, but it is interrelated, and it would be very interesting to compare those networks once both of those studies had been done, to then look at the differences in charity networking and behavior between other charities and their donors, or when they're trying to fundraise.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom. So that's our time just about up. I'd like to say thank you again to Tom for a really interesting presentation. And thank you for answering those questions and giving us a good insight into the methods and the data that you're working with. Our next seminar is on the 30th of May, when Elizabeth Stirling will be presenting on her work. So do look out for that. You can find the full program on the webpage. The link is in the description of the video below. As I said before, we're always looking for new presenters and interesting work. So please do get in touch if you'd like to share your work. It can be at different stages, even ideas and work. This is an early stage that you want to share and get input onto. Is worthwhile, and also more generally, I would welcome feedback on the seminar series, on the format and the topics and so on. If you've got any comments or feedback, then please do get in touch. But otherwise, thanks again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again in a month's time. Thank you.